If you've ever felt like the auto repair business is broken, you're not alone. Everybody's over it. From talking down to selling up to car-splaining mechanics, you're just done putting up with BS. Bad service. At Midas, we're on a mission to redefine car care, where, get this, we talk to you like a real person, helping you plan for today and down the road. Imagine that. We're driving forward with this in mind. Reroute to Midas, where we're putting an end to BS.
Well, what happened in the early part of the 20th century is when they saw the initial evidence for Big Bang cosmology. And the astronomers who were not theists says, we got to get rid of this. They immediately saw that it was just like what the Bible was teaching. And so they said, and they also realized it made the universe way too young, only billions of years. And they said, this isn't going to work. And we're going to try to salvage naturalistic biological evolution. And so you got mathematicians like Sir Arthur Eddington saying, this is repugnant. It's philosophically repugnant. We got to get rid of this beginning of the universe. But then the evidence became overwhelming. There's no doubt that the universe has a beginning. There's no doubt that it's only billions of years old. And so you have philosophical consequences. But yeah, I think you're referring to certain Christians who want the universe to be only thousands of years old.
The history of our Earth is so different from what we can imagine.
The Smithsonian, if they found out about a large skeleton somewhere, was to go get it.
I'm going to assume at least one person is right, because if one person's right, it busts the paradigm.
It all goes back to the fallen cherub. And the problem with the modern day church, they have a very truncated view of the supernatural.
This backdrop that's just pregnant with all kinds of meaning associated with this Mount Hermon event.
Welcome to Blurry Creatures.
And this guy defects from the kingdom. That's a big deal.
All right, welcome back to Blurry Creatures. We have a fun one today, Luke. We got Hugh Ross here, astrophysicist, author of over 20 books. Our podcast, I don't know how much you know about us, but we talk about all the weird stuff in the Bible and all the weird stuff that happens today and in ancient history. And so a lot of that is going back to Genesis, going back to ancient history, talking about the megaliths, pyramids, the giants, and these creatures that people see today, as obviously we're called Blurry Creatures. But we're excited to have you today. You're from San Dimas, and we have this 80s vibe on our show.
Well, I mean, Hugh's actually Canadian. And he hasn't apologized to us yet, but I'm waiting for it to happen. Right? Okay. Canadians love to apologize. No, but I mean...
Grew up in San Dimas, I guess. You were there from the 70s.
I grew up in Vancouver.
Okay, that's right.
Yeah.
But we always make like 80s jokes on the show. We actually had a phone booth from Bill and Ted at our conference here at Conduit Church, and we made all of our guests come out of the phone booth like Bill and Ted. So you were saying that the...
In pre-roll, yeah, you were saying the Circle K is still there.
Circle K is still there, phone booth is gone, and we live about a mile from the Circle K.
There's not many astrophysicists you can make Bill and Ted's jokes with, and that's why I think it's pretty cool.
I mean, with an astrophysicist, perhaps you could put the phone booth back together and make it functional again. There's might be a project out there.
Well, the time machine would be a problem.
But welcome to Blurry Creatures. We kick it off all the time. Like, what are your thoughts on Bigfoot? That's the question we've asked everyone from theologians.
Well, you're asking the right guy.
Let's go.
I was raised where Bigfoot was invented. Oh, they called it Sasquatch.
Yeah.
So British Columbia is the source of all the Bigfoot stories that you hear.
Yeah.
And what really got it going was in the early 1960s, the engineering students at the University of British Columbia, they had a guy who was 6'8" and 300 pounds. So they came up with a Bigfoot suit for him, and they created shoes made out of plywood that were 2 feet long. And then they put him up in the mountains north of Vancouver, where in the wintertime, had him tromp around in the snow. They had a big circle of engineering students around him because they wanted to make sure he didn't get shot by somebody. And they took all kinds of blurry photos of him.
Hey.
And that really got Sasquatch up and running.
Blurry photos, dude. This is...
Yeah, and we do a lot of, like we talked to the premier Bigfoot scientist, Jeff Meldrum, early on in our show. And he's got all the casts of this creature. And I think a lot of the things we do on our show is we go for the data. We try to be more scientific. We don't just bring on the weird stories and then...
Oh, we do that a little bit too, though.
Well, yeah, we do that. But I think that we are data-driven, and I think there was a lot of paranormal shows that don't really want to get into...
So how come you went with Bigfoot? That's a data-free thing.
Well, talk to Jeff Meldrum. He's got the casts, and he's like the premier foot expert in the world, and he was saying, like, look, I know how to look at footprints like nobody else in the world, and he's got, like... What is it, a couple hundred casts of this creature?
10,000 in his office.
Yeah.
He said in his office. And he has a Bigfoot butt print, which is our favorite thing to ask. He says that somebody casted where he sat down, so we got both cheeks at the same time.
All right.
So we try to, prove the case that this creature is out there, and it's not just a hoax. There are hoaxes.
Right.
There definitely are people out there who are trying to hoax people, but it's still been going on for hundreds of years, and... you have all these different names in Native American culture for this creature, and it's amazing to us how many times we'll bring somebody on talking about something unrelated to Bigfoot, and they'll have a Bigfoot story. They'll have seen him, had an encounter.
Just for shout, there was one in Franklin, of all things.
Yeah.
Dude, next door has been wild. You don't live here, but you know what next door is, like where you have this like social media for your neighbors, and you have to like opt in. It sounds really dumb to explain this, but essentially it's like all your neighbors are in the same little group. So for Franklin, someone sent us that somebody in Percy Priest Park up here by the lake had this encounter, thought they had a Bigfoot encounter or whatever. And so they posted, this is Franklin, Tennessee. And then last night, I just randomly sent Nate, somebody posted a UFO experience. And I texted Nate, I'm like, what is happening here on number one on Nextdoor, which is supposed to be like just people complaining about their neighbors and the people that cut their lawn or painted their house or do a good or bad job, whatever. It's really just people. It's really just a lot of people complaining, but it's starting to get weird out there. Everybody in the neighborhood's seeing something out here. It feels like Stranger Things.
Well, you see stuff, but where's the hair? Where's the bones?
Right. That's always the question.
Yeah.
Like
I like it.
Where's the body?
Well,
right?
I mean, we've tried to tackle the skeptical part of the story. Where are the hair? Where's the bones? I think that's the hard part about doing a show like ours, because I listened to a lot of paranormal shows before we started this podcast, and I wanted better answers. And one of the big things we talk about is the Genesis 6 event, where you have these hybrid beings, and then you have this whole narrative of giants in the Old Testament.
Right.
And where do they come from? How is that possible? And we try to look at all the data for the giants existing through things they might have built, and then you have the Smithsonian showing up when these things are being unearthed by farmers around all North America. And it's difficult because I think, and we could probably talk about this today on this episode, of our listeners are like either hardcore conspiracy theorists who they believe everything the science says is a lie, and then you have this other group of people who think that the Bible and science can't go together, that science is the ultimate source of truth. And I like kind of how Jordan Peterson puts it. He says, the Bible is the framework of which all truth comes from. This is the foundation of truth. This is how we know what can be true and what can't be true. And I don't even know where his heart is in terms of his salvation, but he seems to be on this kick lately of going through the Bible and trying to put these things kind of back together. And we were here Sunday listening to you, and I love that you kind of are marrying science and the Bible again, and I think that sometimes our show is a little bit more in the conspiracy realm, and it gets a little weird, but I think we talk a lot about heaven and earth and how can spiritual beings be are they physical? Are they not physical? These are the topics that we talk a lot about on our show, because I think Luke and I often talk outside of the show that there's like a kind of a Gnostic view of the spiritual realm. It's not anywhere. And when people start like sharing their stories, it feels more and more like this stuff is interacting. Heaven and earth are colliding.
Right.
They are overlapping each other. And how do we make sense of that? And I think it would be really good to talk about the science of how have heaven and earth sort of connect, maybe some thoughts on Eden, and sort of the beginning of the story that we're all sort of confused about constantly as Christians.
I would say too, I think your testimony is the perfect place to start. I know that you told this weekend, and it's probably a little bit ad nauseum because you did this, you spoke 3 times this weekend and did the same presentation, but I think it's so powerful because you are an extremely educated, intelligent person who didn't start out as being a Christian. In fact, it was the flip. You started out as a young budding scientist, even as a teenager, and then
hanging out at the Circle K,
looking for answers. So, can you tell us how? Because what Nate said and what I love about your work, and you've written 23 books, and I'd like to touch on the last one too at some point. I've read Why the Universe Is the Way It Is in a Matter of Days. I love those books. I think the way that, and this is what I want to get into with you as well, is you have this very interesting analogy of the book of nature and the book of Scripture. Right, the book of science and the book of Scripture, those two things are not at odds. But I'm going, and I'm kind of, I don't want to steal your thunder here, Hugh, but can you talk about how you got to a place as someone who works in, laws of thermodynamics and physics and, all of these super scientific things, astronomy, measuring distances and stars and all these different things, and how you ended up as a person of faith? Because those two things in our society always seem to be juxtaposed, right? You have this, you either believe in science or you believe in religion, I'll just say, but that's sort of the two roads that it feels like society wants to give you. And those two things seem to be very separate or intentionally separate. And yet, and in our show, we talk about how the ancients didn't divorce the natural from the supernatural. In fact, the ancients, when we read Genesis and the Old Testament, they had a very much a supernatural worldview. In the same way, this is my analogy, I feel like in this post-academic, this post-enlightenment academic paradigm we live in now, we've very much divorced science from the Scripture or from religion, if you will. And so I'm not going to talk more, but I would love for you to share your story because I think it's an amazing testimony of someone who really searched out the answers, and then you came to the conclusion you did.
Well, I became a serious student of astronomy and physics at age 7.
That's incredible, dude. That is first off.
That's how it is.
That's how it is, yeah.
I was writing love poems at 7.
Dude, Nate was watching Ninja Turtles, yeah.
No, but every year I was growing up, I would look at a different subdiscipline of astrophysics. And when I was 16, I spent a year studying cosmology, the science of the origin and history of the universe. In 19th century astrophysics, the idea was that the universe was eternal. And then what happened in the early part of the 20th century, they began to see that the galaxies were moving away from us. And this was the birth of the Big Bang theory for the origin of the universe. And, when I was in my teenage years, there was a lot of debate going on. Is it Big Bang? Does the universe oscillate like you see in Hinduism where it reincarnates? Is it a hesitating universe? Is it a steady state universe? And I could see that the evidence was favoring Big Bang. And if it's Big Bang, there's a beginning to the universe. If there's a beginning, there must be a cosmic beginner. So as at age 17, I began to say, hey, I want to find that cosmic beginner. Didn't really know where to look. I thought, well, Immanuel Kant's a good place to start because he's considered the father of cosmology. So I read his Critique of Pure Reason, and I said, this isn't really coming together. It's not fitting the astrophysics that I know. I looked at René Descartes, and the high school I went to is filled with refugees from all over the world. And so people said, hey, you need to read the Hindu Vedas. You need to read the Quran, the Buddhist commentaries. So I began to go through all that, Zoroastrianism, Baha'i, and everything that they were saying was not fitting what I knew to be true about the universe. And when I say I didn't really get to know Christians until I showed up at Caltech, I did see 2 from 30 feet away when I was 11 years of age. And these were 2 businessmen that came into our public school, put 2 boxes on our teacher's desk, didn't say a single word, but those boxes were Gideon Bibles.
There you go.
So it was at age 17, I began to read that Gideon Bible and realized this book isn't like the other books I've been looking at. It actually invites subjective testing. I discovered the scientific method in the early creation texts in the Bible.
Can you explain that?
Well, the public school I went to, I got taught the scientific method in grade 1, grade 2, is in all 12 years. And so that was something that I could see immediately, like just looking at Genesis chapter 1. It begins with a statement, this is the point of view from which you're to interpret the 6 creation days. That's step 1 of what we call the scientific method. Don't interpret until you first establish the point of view. Right. Step 2, don't interpret until you establish the starting conditions. Genesis 1:2 gives you 4 initial conditions. Step 3, don't even try to interpret until you determine what happens, when, where, and what order. Those are the 6 creation days. The next step is look at the final conditions, see how they differ from the starting conditions. Then you make an interpretation. But in the scientific method, your first interpretation is lightly held without emotional investment. Then you want to test it. And the thing I noticed about the Bible, it had more than 24 lengthy texts that dealt with creation. The other holy books would have 1. The Quran has 3, but the Bible's got more than 24. And so I said, I got all these opportunities to test my interpretation by looking at what Job says, Psalm says, Proverbs says, Isaiah, 2 Peter. And then 9 years later, I found out why the scientific method is in the Bible. That's the origin of the scientific method.
Yeah.
Back in the Reformation era, that people were looking at the Bible for themselves. They saw this. They applied it to their scientific research. So it's no accident that the scientific revolution exploded out of Reformation Europe.
That's wild.
Some say Genesis 6 is the Rosetta Stone of the Old Testament, but that's not the Rosetta Stone we're talking about today. We're talking about the software, Rosetta Stone. It helps you learn another language fast.
Would it come in handy? Maybe it'd come in handy if you are traveling abroad, say a trip with the Blurry guys to Peru or Costa Rica, perhaps. Maybe you want to learn Spanish. Rosetta Stone has been the trusted expert in language learning for 30 years with millions of users and 25 languages offered, including Spanish, French, Italian, German, Korean, Chinese, Japanese, Dutch, Arabic, Polish, and more.
That's right. The built-in true accent feature gives you feedback on your pronunciation.
Nate, you say gracias?
Yeah.
Just making sure you're saying it right.
Rosetta Stone's convenient desktop app options mean you can learn anytime, anywhere. Luke, it'd be great if we could do this podcast in Spanish, and one of the best ways to do that is Rosetta Stone.
And one of the things great about the software is it not only is the fastest way to learn a language, but it's personalized, right? It helps you recognize how you can improve pronunciation. There's short, flexible lessons that start at just 10 minutes at a time. And for us, look, we want to take this blurry bus all over the world. And one way to do that effectively is to be able to speak the languages of the world. So Rosetta Stone is our chosen software of choice if we're learning another language.
Don't put off learning that language. There's no better time right now than to get started. Blurry Creatures listeners get Rosetta Stone's lifetime membership for 50% off. Visit rosettastone.com/today.
That's 50% off unlimited access to 25 language courses for the rest of your life. Redeem your 50% off Rosetta Stone at rosettastone.com/today.
Do you believe that how we got that method came from heaven itself? Like we didn't, did God give that to his people?
Well, something you see in the other holy books is they basically appeal to subjective testing. If you have a warm feeling, it's true. The Bible was distinct. It actually exhorted objective testing. Paul says, put everything to the test, hold fast to that which is good and true. And multiple times you see the Bible exhorting objective testing. Don't believe it until you first put it to the
John
test.
Says test the spirits.
Test the spirits, right, yeah.
That's fast. So you read the Quran, you read the Vedas. I don't want to point this out to our listeners, like, when you're talking about you investigate, you read all of these holy books looking for something in a faith system that can align with.
Well, here's the way I put it to the test. I said, what I see in the universe, everything is consistent, it's harmonious.
Yeah.
It looks like it's a single plan.
Yep.
So I said, if there's a book that comes from the one that created the universe, it'll have the same characteristics. There won't be contradictions. Everything it says about science and history will be correct. And so I looked for mistakes. So when I went through the Quran, for example, I said, okay, do I see any contradictions here? Do I see any statements about future science that I know are not true, or future history? And I did that with all these different holy books. And I got to the Bible, the thing I noticed, number one, It's talking about geography, history, and science all over the place, way more than the other holy books. It's like it's begging you to put it to the test. And unlike the other holy books, everything it has to say, you can prove is correct.
It's like Paul says, you're without an excuse, you know, because you can see that. And as an artist and someone who's always been drawn to creating things, I always find it interesting that when, you know, a big portion of humans, when they read the Bible, they don't want to give any credit to someone creating this. But yet, if they created something, they sure as heck would want credit for what they made. And, you know, as an artist, you see the handiwork. And for me, as a young age, I thought, even if I didn't know anything about this, this is designed. These things are put together, and there's ecosystems, and it feels magical. And I don't know why some people the magic is out of the equation.
Well, you know, right on the first page, it says we're created in the image of God.
Yeah.
It's interesting how we create in the same manner that God creates.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look inside the cell, you see these amazing machines. You see piston engines. I mean, you see rotary engines. The only difference is they're better than the ones that we make.
Yeah, they don't fall apart 10 years down the road. Yeah.
Yeah.
So suss this out for me, Hugh, because you land on the Bible and you find it inerrant. I know this is your new book, right? I'm fishing there. But I think a lot of Christians would have a hard time saying, the Big Bang was the theory is the theory at the time prevailing for astronomers, astrophysicists, and that has got to be at odds with the creation story if you're a Christian and you believe the Bible. So how did you find those two things congruent? How does that?
Well, what happened in the early part of the 20th century is when they saw the initial evidence for Big Bang cosmology. And the astronomers who were not theists says, we got to get rid of this. They immediately saw that it was just like what the Bible was teaching. And so they said, and they also realized it made the universe way too young, only billions of years. And they said, this isn't going to work if we're going to try to salvage naturalistic biological evolution.
Right.
And so you got mathematicians like Sir Arthur Eddington saying, this is repugnant. It's philosophically repugnant. We got to get rid of this beginning of the universe. But then the evidence became overwhelming. There's no doubt that the universe has a beginning. There's no doubt that it's only billions of years old. And so you have philosophical consequences. But yeah, I think you're referring to certain Christians who want the universe to be only thousands of years old.
Yes, there's this young Earth idea, right? And it's pulling from the scriptures and genealogies and.
Well, my appeal to them is, hey, we only differ by 6 zeros. It's only a factor of a million. And you look at the difference between both young Earth and old Earth creationism and atheism, and it's like, hey, there's a huge, way greater difference.
Right. Yeah, we have some friends that we have on the show, and they differ. And one's a theologian and one's a researcher. They differ on things, but what they say is that what they agree on is the hinge, is the biblical text and the gospel.
Right.
I think what we've discovered on our show is there could be a hybrid of these ideas. And we have a lot of people have black and white views of these things, but the earth can be old, but humans might not be that old. Well, we were put here later. Or, you know what I'm saying? Like, we can rescue some of these, I'm here or here, and be like, well, maybe they're both right.
Well, in that sense, my young earth creationist friends believe that Adam and Eve was specially created relatively recently, thousands of years ago. And I say, hey, that's our view as well.
Yeah.
We believe that all of humanity is descended from one man and one woman that God specially created.
Yeah.
Now, I personally have the creation of Adam and Eve during the last ice age. So we're talking tens of thousands of years ago. They're talking thousands of years ago. But hey, now we're only differing by a factor of 10.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would argue that if you look at Genesis chapter 2, it has to be an ice age event, because it tells us that there were 4 known rivers that came close together in the Garden of Eden. Well, the only location where those 4 named rivers come close together today is 200 feet below sea level. It's in the southeastern portion of the Persian Gulf. But during the last ice age, sea levels were 390 feet lower. So that would have been dry ground during the last ice age.
Mm.
So,
but that's wild. We haven't heard, we've talked a bit about Eden with theologians. We talked about it ad nauseum with Tim Mackey from the Bible Project and his ideas of.
Because he said it was on a mountain, though. That was the difference. I think he believed that Eden was on a mountain.
Well, if it's on a mountain, it's really difficult to get four rivers to come together.
Well, that's what that was the weirdest part about that episode. But we do see we've uncovered that there are a lot of megalithic structures underwater.
Yes,
there are some in the like the Bahamas in the Caribbean. There are some in Japan. Even one we talked about off the coast of California. There were some discoveries of these ancient, what they were building, and it's under. How do they build it? There's a lot of water over that.
Well, it's underwater now, but it would have been above water back then.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we see evidence for human habitation during the last ice age. It's not just, the Middle East. In fact, I've just written a book on Noah's flood, making the point that there's now new research that shows what we see in Genesis 10 and 11, where humans were living in one locale and God scattered humanity over the whole face of the earth.
Bravo. Yeah.
What's interesting is you get the same date for the migration into and colonization of Northern Europe, Southern Europe, Western Africa, Australia, Tasmania, New Guinea, Borneo, the Philippines. All of that happened at the same time. But that date is 42,000 years ago.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, you're in the last ice age, which means Noah's flood would have to happen a little bit before that.
Why do you think Christians have a problem with old Earth?
Well, I think the big reason why is they struggle with the concept of death before the sin of Adam. And so they blame Adam for all sin, but it's basically they think all life. And I keep reminding them, if you look at Romans 5, it says death through sin came upon all people. So it's not talking about plants and animals. We're the only species that can sin. And so Paul is being very careful to say, no, this is the initiation of human death. We're not talking the death of plants and animals. And also notice, this seems to be a controversy for people who live in cities. If you live in cities, you don't see the advantages of carnivorous activity. But people who live in rural areas recognize, hey, you get rid of the carnivores, the death rate of the herbivores skyrockets because there's nothing to check the disease. There's nothing to check the overconsumption.
That's like Yellowstone.
Right.
Yellowstone was a great sort of microcosm of that. When they got rid of the wolves, things went haywire. The whole ecosystem was messed up. I wanted to, can you walk us through your sussing out? Because this is the whole story. Like you read through all these holy texts, you find that your views in science are backed up by the creation story, and this is how it works. And I know this is also the point where a lot of Christians diverge, because if you're a young earther, 7 days is 7 days. But we know that there's a lot of sort of ambiguity about that word in the entirety of Scripture. And when you walk through talking about the Hebrew and the way that you see creation from a scientific and also from a biblical standpoint, I think it's a compelling case that I would love for our listeners to hear. You sort of briefly to walk through that if you
Sure.
feel comfortable with you. Yeah.
Well, I wasn't raised in church. I didn't know Christian. So when I looked at the Bible, I was just reading it the way it was on the page.
Right.
I didn't even know there was a controversy on this issue until 9 years later.
You're like, wait, what?
What's going on here? But, as I opened it up, I said, okay, this word day must have at least three distinct literal definitions, because three are used in the text. Creation day 1 is using the word day for the daylight hours. Creation day 4, it uses the word day. It's contrasting seasons, days, and years. That's day as 24 hours. But Genesis 2:4 uses the word day for the entire creation history. That's day as a long period of time. And then I noticed that the first 6 days end with an evening-morning statement. And I didn't know what the Hebrew words for evening and morning meant, but I knew at a minimum that evening-morning phrase was telling us each day has a start time, each day has an end time. Day 2 ends and day 3 begins. So it's 6 consecutive periods of creation. Then when you get to day 7, there's no evening-morning phrase, which means we're still in the 7th day. And you got Psalm 95 and Hebrews 4, Old and New Testament, both stating we're still in God's 7th day. And it's the day when God doesn't create. And I remember telling the audience on Sunday, that was like a light bulb moment for me because, when I was 11 years of age, I read this book on evolutionary biology, and I said, it doesn't work. We have all this evidence for new families, new orders, classes, and phyla before humanity, and none of that after humanity. And when I read the Bible for the first time, it says this answers the fossil record enigma.
How do we know it was before?
Well, okay, when you look before humanity in the fossil record, you can see evidences for the appearance of new body plans amongst the animals, new phyla. You see the new classes, the new orders. It's all over the fossil record. But as soon as you get to the human era, you see none of that. We do see some evidence for new species appearing.
Okay.
But that's about where it stops. And then from a naturalistic perspective, you would say, okay, we got gene exchange, natural selection, mutations, and epigenetics.
Yeah.
This will produce small changes in a species over time, and eventually you might get a new species. And if you wait long enough, you get a proliferation of species that produces a new genus. And if you wait much longer, you get a proliferation of genera that produces families. Families will produce orders, orders classes. Last of all, you get the phyla. But as I explained on Sunday, when you look at the fossil record, it's exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
The phyla show up first, the species show up last. And atheistic, paleontologists look at this and said, this is not at all what we expect. It's like the more we study the Avalon and Cambrian explosions of life, the mass speciation events, it's the exact opposite of what we predict. From a materialistic perspective, something beyond the material must be in operation.
So things aren't evolving. So the Darwinism is trash. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. It's bad science. It's bad theory. It's bad science because.
Well, I will say this in credit for Charles Darwin. He said, look, if my theory is right, these are things that you'll discover. And what I find fascinating is that he made a prediction. Okay, the animals that look most like us will also be the most like us in terms of mental and intellectual capabilities.
Interesting.
He said, test it. Nobody tested it until the 21st century. And what they discovered is that chimpanzees are not the smartest non-human animals. It's crows and ravens are the smartest non-human animals.
Yeah.
They're way smarter than the big apes.
And they hold grudges too. They know your face, and if you're mean to them, they know.
Yeah. So let's walk us through creation here then. As a guy who was in the studio a lot, made a lot of songs, recorded a lot of songs, you start somewhere and you need those parts and those layers in order for the song to come together. And when you read the Genesis story, you see that God is really specific on how he sort of adds these layers to creation. What do you see there? And do you see how it's a scientific way that he does this? Because you need, as we know, other animals and plants need each other.
Well, that's what got to me when I was 17 going through the Bible for the first time. It's like everything is correct. It's all in just exactly the order we would expect from a scientific perspective. It's like you get in Genesis 1:3, let there be light, and I says, okay. And you got the Spirit of God brooding over the surface of the waters. I said, that sounds like the origin of microbial life. But not until day 5 do you get animals. Not until day 3 do you get any kind of vegetation. And so it's like, this is what you'd expect. It takes billions of years of microbial activity in order to transform the chemistry, the surface of the earth, so that plants and animals can exist. And so, yes, we would expect the trees would be late, the animals would be late. And then you get into creation day 6. It mentions 3 different categories of land mammals. And they're the 3 categories that are crucial for launching human civilization. So it's like, last of all, God created these land mammal categories that would help us launch civilization. The proof of that is when humans came into Australia, they wiped out 94% of all the large-bodied bird and mammal species. They couldn't get out of the Stone Age. We need those animals in order to launch civilization. So it's like God provided over the history of Earth with everything we need, not only to live, but to have global civilization so that we can take the good news of how we can be redeemed from our sin to all the people groups in the world. It was his intent all along that we'd have civilization and technology, but that required certain plants, certain trees, and certain animals.
Do you know, when I'm hearing you describe this, it kind of sounds like the modern scientific narrative is similar. You know, they believe it was a long time and these things evolved. And Christians say someone signed the painting.
Yes.
And there was a signature on there, and modern science just can't put that signature on the painting. Why is that?
Well, they do for the universe. I mean, I've got 50 books on what's called the anthropic principle. Almost all of them written by people who are not believers. And they say, when we look at the universe, we see overwhelming evidence that has been designed to make possible the existence of life. But most of them stop at the level of the universe. And so what I did in Design to the Core is say, we don't just see it at the level of the universe. We see it in our super galaxy cluster. We see it in our galaxy cluster. We see it in our galaxy. We see it in our star. We see it in the planets that accompany Earth in the solar system. We see it in the asteroid and comet belts. We see it in the interior of the Earth, the interior of the moon. It's ubiquitous. It's on all size scales, which means that there must be a creator that was intent on creating a planet on which humans can live and thrive, where they can have the technology. And see what happens there, we're now bringing the creator up close. At the level of the universe, you can keep God at arm's length. But when you're talking our star, our moon, our planet, the life on planet Earth, now we have, it's very clear, this is a God that's paying attention to how I live my life. And a lot of scientists, and not just scientists, but a lot of people in general, they're uncomfortable with a God being that intimate because it means that this is a God that's evaluating my life.
Yeah.
And so if you want to be autonomous, you're going to be wanting to deny all this stuff. And you see this in Romans 1. They know the truth, but they engage in self-imposed ignorance because this is threatening their autonomy.
Hey, parents. Greenlight is here to take one big thing off your to-do list, teaching your kids about money. With a Greenlight debit card and money app of their own, kids and teens learn to earn, save, and invest. You can send money instantly, set flexible controls, and get real-time notifications of your kids' money activity. Set up chores and put allowance on autopilot to reward them for their hard work. Then learn about the world of money together. Get 1 month free when you sign up at greenlight.com/podcast.
Do you think that's because scientists are trained to feel that way about things? Because, you know, you have to kind of be like a Supreme Court justice, and you just have to be like, I'm devoting myself to the Constitution, and I can't bring my feelings into this.
Well, scientists are just like everybody else. And so, you know, there are a lot of believers in the scientific community. I mean, it's a myth that all scientists are atheists.
Yeah, but it's like that you have to get out of that. You can't change the data because you feel a certain way. It's, you know what I mean?
Well, we scientists are, trained to be objective, to put our feelings aside. But if you're truly objective, it's clear there's a creator behind all this, and it's a personal being. And it's a personal being who wants intimate contact with his creation. So if you're truly objective, that's the conclusion you come to. But not everybody comes to that conclusion because that threatens your personal autonomy.
Yeah.
You're saying that each day was a long period of time in which God created and continued to create. And each of these, it feels like you're building a layer on top of it. So God creates the universe, and then he's hovering over the waters. And I know you talked about how the point of view changes, right? So you have this big macro point of view of God saying, let there be light and separating the light and the darkness. And then the next scene is from the surface of the earth, underneath the clouds. And I really like the way you pointed the difference there. But in these days, in the Yom, I think is the Hebrew, you contend and that there's based on the scientific record and the fossil record and that these are long periods of time, but each time God is creating in these days, in these epochs or whatever you want to call it, he's setting the table for ultimately creating humanity, right? But it's like he's making it's like a recipe. I don't know how to put it. Like you start with this, and then you're making the base for the soup, and then you're adding in, and all these things build upon each other to allow for humanity to be able to exist.
Yeah, we're talking 6 long, finite periods of time. And like in astronomy, our data comes from the past because it takes time for light to travel from the galaxies that we observe. And so you got people like Freeman Dyson saying, when you look at the universe, you can't avoid the conclusion the universe knew we were coming. It's like you can see this being step by step by step prepared for the entry of human beings at the one time window when humans can exist. We couldn't have existed earlier. We can't exist later. We're living in that narrow window of time in which the physics of the universe and the earth allows us to live and thrive. And so the time window is going to close, but the time window is going to be open long enough that we get to move from this creation to the next creation.
And that's actually, before I wanted to ask you about that before we got there, but I was going to say, I want to just reinforce that what you're saying is that as this process of creation is happening, this is not evolution. God is actually creating the animals as fully, like they're full.
Well, a good analogy is
right?
watching someone build a home for you. They put the framing up first, then they put the drywall on, then they put the electrical in. And so we got God doing the same thing. He's building a home. And we have Jesus saying, I'm going to go away and build a home for you in the new creation.
Yeah.
And so again, it's a step-by-step process. And we're created in the image of God. Notice, we create the same way.
Do you believe that you could go to heaven right now if there was a way, there's some technology to get there? Is it a physical place?
Well, the easiest technology is just to die, right?
So, true.
Hey, here's the quick way.
Well, I say that because sometimes in my church, people say, I want a perfect healing. They say, do you really know what you're asking for?
Yeah.
You're asking for immediate death so that you can be perfectly healed. So,
well, like at Jesus' baptism, it opens up.
Yes.
And we see it.
Right.
And God says, is my son, and is it someplace we can go to?
Well, we know there is, just based on the physics of the universe. We have space-time theorems that prove that space and time are created, which means there has to be a causal agent beyond space-time, matter, and energy. So there clearly is a realm beyond this physical universe. The physics proves it. The Bible's been stating it for thousands of years. We got Jesus rising bodily from the dead.
Yeah.
No one can deny that historical fact. And so it's like, and hey, we do realize that we're not just physical beings. You can't explain the operation of our mind. Mm-hmm. Our brain is not adequate to explain everything our mind does. There has to be something beyond the chemistry and the physics that explains what we do just with our mind. So
like a software. There's a software in there running.
Well, that's more than software. I mean, our brain is the hardware. We can see the software operating within the brain, but we don't see the programmer. And so there's something beyond. And physicists have devoted, thick books to trying to understand, can we explain the human mind with the physics that we know of the human brain? And the answer is no. There really is a spirit nature to us human beings. Now, the plants don't have that. And what's interesting about Genesis, it uses the word create 3 times. First for the universe, the second time in creation, day 5, for soulish animals. And it's referring to these animals that are endowed with mind, will, and emotions.
French bulldogs, definitely.
Yeah, definitely French bulldogs. So, and you can't explain that emotion from physics and chemistry and biology. But then it says that human beings, it uses the word create again. We're not just physical and soulish, we're also spiritual. Now, as I was mentioning on Sunday, God designed these animals to form relationships with a higher species, us human beings. He designed us to form a relationship with a higher being, God himself.
There's an order, yeah. I wanted to ask this, you're sitting with an astronomer and a physicist. There's some chapters in your book and why the universe is the way it is that talks about the necessity for the laws of physics and the laws of thermodynamics and electromagnetism and these things that God has intentionally created that hold us and God being a God of order, can you espouse a little bit on how those things, why and how those things hold our lives together?
Well, I wrote that book because the only argument that atheists have for their atheism, they say an all-powerful, all-loving God would not tolerate evil and suffering for his creatures.
Yeah.
And I said, someone needs to write a book about the physics of evil. So that's why the universe is all about, why the universe is the way it is. Basically making the point that, yes, thermodynamics, gravity, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces, that permits physical life to exist. But those laws of physics are optimally designed so that evil can be eradicated quickly and efficiently, while our free will is actually enhanced in its capacity to receive and experience love. And the proof of all that is the moment that evil is eradicated, there's no more thermodynamics, there's no more gravity, there's no more electromagnetism. A second proof is that we notice those laws of physics work to restrain the expression of our evil. It's something I taught my sons when they were growing up, saying, look, if I don't discipline you, the laws of physics will.
Yeah.
The laws of physics will be a lot harsher. And it's like, you see this in Genesis chapter 3. The moment Adam and Eve sinned, God says, from now on, you're going to have to do more work. You're going to experience more pain. And the problem is when we sin, we ruin things. And it takes extra work, extra time, and extra pain to undo the damage that our sin and evil has caused. And none of us biologically enjoys extra pain, extra work, or wasted time. So the laws of physics motivate us to avoid evil and pursue virtue. But we quickly discover we do not have the resources to do what the laws of physics impel us to do. And this is God saying, look, I'm here to do for you what you can't do for yourself. Come to me. And when I read the book of Job, I realized this book is the oldest book in the Bible. Job figured it out.
Smart guy.
He figured out. Yeah, he was a smart guy. He figured out that the physics of the universe is designed to show us, hey, if you go down an evil path, there are consequences and they're not pleasant. And he also figured out, I don't have the resources to do what I know must need to be done.
I was going to say, the rumor is you were friends with Chuck Missler and
John Eldridge.
Yeah,
I like
John Eldridge.
Yeah.
But
I actually baptized John Eldridge.
Let's go.
He's still wild at heart, man.
Let's
I love
go.
that. I love his
he's still wild at heart.
Yeah.
I know Chuck was kind of early to a lot of the stuff that we talk about on our show. We talk a lot about how this science and technology was given to us, like outside of, what God intended, that these sons of God exchanged women for technology. I know that it's briefly mentioned in Genesis, but what I think is interesting is that you see this explosion in technology, which obviously is the science behind it. How much of that have you explored, and what do you think?
Well, Chuck, I got to know Chuck, and he likes to speculate.
Sure.
But often his speculation goes way too far.
That's our show.
Yeah.
We love that.
But, I was explaining to Chuck, the ancients didn't need any help from supernatural beings to do everything that they accomplished. It's in my latest book, Rescuing Inerrancy, where I got a chapter saying the ancients weren't stupid. They built thousands of stone observatories, so it was no problem for them to build pyramids and other structures that were accurate to an arc-minute precision. They had the technology to pull that off. They didn't need any help from extraterrestrial beings.
Well, that's the ancient alien theory, right?
Yeah. And they knew the world was spherical. They knew how far away the sun was. They knew the stars were bodies. They were not dumb at all. So
I was going to ask you about that. Like, what are some things that they did scientifically? You can look back and be like, yeah, they knew stuff that we didn't know today.
Well, we now know that because when I was in school, we were taught that the ancients believed the world was flat. The truth is, no matter where you go in the world, they all knew that the world was spherical. The flat earth hypothesis was actually invented in the 18th century. And was invented by European philosophers who were intent on discrediting Christianity. So they came up with this idea that the ancients believed that the world was flat. that they believe that there was a metal dome over the earth with water above. And I make the point, hey, in Egypt and Mesopotamia, they were irrigating their agricultural land. They knew Archimedes' principle, that there's a limit to how high up you can pump water. So they knew the dome thing wasn't correct. And one of the things I put in my latest book, Rescuing Inerrancy, what's interesting about humans, we engage in fantasy. And that's counter to our best interests in terms of basic survival. You want to spend all your time making sure you got food on the table and shelter and all that. And yet even the most primitive societies, they spend an inordinate amount of time on fantasy. And all of us enjoy that. And so I say, hey, the ancients wrote about this dome over the earth, but that was part of their fantasy literature. It was not part of their science literature. So I'll give you a quick example. How about 15 centuries from now, we have archaeologists, doing their work in the ruins of Hollywood, and they find these film canisters and say, boy, people in the 20th century were sure dumb. They thought dinosaurs roamed the earth and people were making pets out of them. And so, they could easily presume that the Flintstones was actually a science documentary, but in fact, it's just fantasy.
Yeah.
And so it's crucial we distinguish between the fantasy literature of the ancients and their science literature and their history literature.
Something you said that I wanted to flesh out because we almost got there with day 7 of creating, right? And so we know that, and you mentioned this, when God creates the new heavens and new earth, when the New Jerusalem, we talk about sort of all that stuff comes down. You said that all of the laws of physics, thermodynamics, those things, and gravity, et cetera, will cease to exist in this new space. Can you talk about your ideas of what the second creation is going to sort of entail? Because it's interesting. I love the way you put that. Like, day 7 doesn't end, and God is resting; He's not creating, right? So that's why. I think that's super interesting because we don't see the things that we would have seen in the previous days, right? Like it is as it is until
for 6 days God creates. On the 7th day He rests. The 7th day will end when His work of redemption is done. What I find interesting is that our Sabbath is a day we put aside to focus on the most important issues of life. And what I notice in the Bible, it says that God began His works of redemption before He created anything at all, which implies everything that God creates is for the purpose of making possible the redemption of billions of humans from their sin and evil.
Well, I mean, that's incredible to think about, though, right, Hugh? I mean, you're like, God knew it was coming, and so He intently designed.
He intently designed it with redemption in mind.
That's amazing, yeah.
And what's really amazing is everything we see in the universe, all of its events, all of its components, is designed to make possible the redemption of billions of human beings. In fact, I'm telling my secular peers, look, I know you're not a Christian, I know you're not even a theist, but if you will do your scientific research from a biblical redemptive perspective, it'll make you a better scientist. You'll be more efficient in making discoveries. Based on the principle, everything that we see is designed for redemption. And of course, my goal is that once they see that it works, it makes them a better scientist. They say, gee, I think I better pay attention to what this book, the Bible, is saying about what I need to do with my life.
What do you think this new creation looks like then?
Well, I think the fundamental point is this day of rest is going to end. God will create again. Jesus said He's going away to prepare a place for us.
Yeah.
There's an 8th day of creation coming. And for that matter, maybe God's got a whole bunch of creation weeks on His calendar planned out. Who knows?
Awesome.
The amazing thing is He says, I'm going to use redeemed humans to manage my new creation. And they'll be teaching the angels, and they'll be managing over everything that God creates. And yes, when you read Revelation 21, it says there's no death, there's no decay. Nothing decays. That means no thermodynamics. And then it talks about light where there's no shadows or darkness. This isn't electromagnetism. Right. It's a completely different kind of light. In fact, it says we'll all glow with light, and God will glow with the brightest light of all. Right. So it's like everything's going to be radiating some kind of non-electromagnetic light. And you mentioned the New Jerusalem. I mean, Revelation 21 describes it as an enormous structure.
A cube or a pyramid.
A cube or a pyramid with corners, and it's 1,500 miles and on each side.
Yeah.
And as a physicist, I can tell you, if there's gravity, anything that big will be forced into a spherical shape. This is not spherical. It's got corners.
Yeah.
So we're talking about no gravity. And it's like, okay, if nothing's going to decay, gravity will make things decay. I mean, if you live long enough, your chin will begin to pull down towards your belly.
Right.
Yeah.
Other things sag a lot too.
A lot of things will sag, right?
We don't know. We don't know about that yet.
It's starting, baby.
Hugh, what do you think scientifically changes when sin enters the scene? Like about Adam, the
well, it
creation
tells
itself.
us in John 3:18, it says, "Cursed is the ground because of you." It's not that God changed the ground. He didn't change the physics. He didn't change the earth. It's humans that were changed. And because humans are now sinners, when they work the ground, they spoil the ground. The ground doesn't produce like it should. We see this today. Farmers are abusing the soil that they're trying to get food from. And so our abuse makes it less productive. We abuse the animals instead of taking good care of them. We abuse them, and they become less productive for us. So, yeah, what changed was human beings. And we see that explicitly stated in Jeremiah, where God says, hey, you people change your mind all the time, but I'm a God that's immutable. I don't change. As proof, look to the laws that govern the heavens and the earth. As they don't change, I don't change. So the physics has been intact since God created the universe. They'll remain intact according to Romans 8:23 until the full number of humans that God intends to redeem have been redeemed. When that happens, the laws of physics will have fulfilled their ultimate purpose, and God will replace the laws of physics with different laws of physics. I think he's even going to replace the dimensions. We're not going to be constrained to a single dimension at time in the new creation. I don't know about you guys, but when I gave my life to Christ, I thought, gee, my name's near the end of the alphabet. I'm probably going to have to wait several million years to have a private conversation with Paul or Moses or David and realize, wait a minute, I'm wrong. In the new creation, we're going to be delivered from linear time and be able to experience geometric time. So billions of us will be able to have a simultaneous private one-on-one conversation.
What do you think changes about humans then, scientifically? If creation's cursed and it's still fairly what it was, what about what changed about a human being?
Well, what changed about human beings is that we now are in rebellion against God. And so we were not taking instructions from God. I mean, God says, hey, I'm making you human beings managers. You're to manage the planet for your benefit and the benefit of all life. But because of our sin, we say, hey, we're going to put our benefit above the benefit of all other life. Or I'm going to make it my benefit, but it's not going to be your benefit. So we begin to express a selfishness to a degree that spoils it for everybody.
Do you believe like genetically we changed though? Like
I don't think we changed it genetically.
Okay.
I mean, what we notice is that the moment that Adam and Eve sinned, he kicked them out of the garden, and he sent two angels to prevent them from having access to the tree of life. The tree of life was there to reverse the effects of thermodynamics and gravity.
Okay.
So it's like, that's why I think Adam and Eve sinned relatively quickly, because, you know, if they had waited 40 years to sin, they would say, gee, I noticed a little bit of decay here. I better go to that tree of life and fix this. But the fact that they saw no need to go to the tree of life tells us they probably sinned relatively quickly.
That's what I was going to ask. I was going to ask if you thought, and that's actually the answer, but I was going to see if in the garden, the laws of nature, if you will, so thermodynamics, electromagnetism, if that was different, but it makes more sense that there was a source, right, that they could sort of, I don't know, regenerate or not age, or it's the fountain of youth, right, where they eat from the tree of life and they don't die. But would that precipitate that we were, because that was before death entered the world, right?
Well,
or we could decay but not die. Maybe is that
we could decay, but getting access to the tree of life, we could reverse the decay. And so that's why God says, hey, we got to stop them from getting to the tree of life, because they'll live forever physically, but be dead forever spiritually. And so God's goal was to use physical death to deliver us from the far worse consequence of spiritual death.
Love that.
So there was some sort of, are angelic beings dying at a slower rate than humans then?
Well, notice there's no redemptive opportunity for the fallen angels. When they sinned, it was permanent because they're already in an eternally existing state. And so that's why God rushed to ensure we didn't get access to the tree of life. He didn't want us to be in the same horrible spot that the fallen angels were.
It's an act of mercy.
It was an act of mercy saying, hey, notice he loved us so much he even was willing to have his own son be killed on our behalf.
Yeah, I know. And we talked about that a little bit on the show, that, you know, it seems like some people have a little bit more of a Gnostic view of Eden. It's more like,
ethereal?
Like you said, fantasy, ghostly. It wasn't actually an actual place, metaphorical.
No, I think it's a real place. It was subject to the same physics that everywhere else here on Earth is subject to. The physics was no different. The only difference was it was planted by God. It's a lot easier to take care of a garden that someone actually fixed up for you in the first place.
Yeah.
And then there was that tree of life in the middle of the garden where they say, hey, if you ever notice any decay, you can go there.
Do you think that, okay, if we have this longer time period and the Earth is much older, were there other humans existing around Adam and Eve when they were in Eden?
I don't think so. We do know there were bipedal primates, but every one of those bipedal...
Sasquatch?
No, not Sasquatch.
Neanderthals?
He was out there.
Neanderthals, yes.
Come on. I think
Homo
he was out
erectus,
there.
yes. Well, I mean, you talk about Sasquatch. There's been speculation that maybe some of the Neanderthals survived, and that's what Sasquatch is all about.
Let's go.
All hairy guys out there.
Well,
I've
some
heard
people
that.
say, you know, there was like, you know, there's language that seems to suggest there were,
It's
Eden
the
was set
cities
apart.
with Cain and marking Cain, and there's people that have an idea there was pre-Adamic people groups.
Well, for what it's worth, I got a whole chapter on the Nephilim in my book, Navigating Genesis, and an appendix. And you might like this. I got a piece in there called The Physics of Basketball.
Hey.
And the physics of basketball is that your ability to sink a basket, given equal skill, goes up with a square of your height, which means a 7-footer should get twice as many baskets as a 5-footer. But what you notice in the NBA is that once you get above 7 feet, their scoring ability drops. And
Steph Curry's not tall.
Yeah. Well, the problem is that you lose mobility when you get to that height. And so you're probably aware there was a big feud between Kobe Bryant and Shaquille O'Neal.
Yeah, here we go, Hugh. Here we go.
You know what was the course of that? They were good friends, but what was annoying to Kobe Bryant, he had to wait for Shaquille O'Neal to lumber down the court. He was way more mobile, and it's like, I'm going to sink the basket if you're not coming down here fast
There's
enough.
a lot of pride there, too. Yeah.
So,
Unless they had some sort of genetic...
well, that's my whole point, because once you get above 8 feet, the loss of mobility is really severe. And what we notice in the Bible, Goliath, even if you use a short cubit, he's 9 feet 9 inches tall. Yeah. And it says he carried at least 250 pounds of weapons and armor into battle. No human at that height would be able to do that. And he was able to fight. Yeah. And so it's like there's something supernatural about the Nephilim. And then you got Og, the king of Bashan. He had a
13-foot bed.
13-foot bed,
Oh,
6
King
feet
Og,
wide.
you know,
yeah.
he likes his big beds.
He likes his big beds, yeah.
Hugh, what would you say is something fantastical that you believe in, that your peers or people in the field of science would say, that's crazy? Because I mean, I think on our show, I've heard so many stories, and if some of these are true, you know, I've got to make room for them. You know?
Well, where I get it is that, I was an amateur astronomer before I became a professional. And this goes back to my teenage years. And so I was the one that had to process all the UFO reports. So I wound up becoming an expert on UFOs without any intent. They just said, hey, you know the night sky, you process the reports. And what I noticed is I was very skeptical about UFOs. I thought, they're all natural explanations, or they're hoaxes, or that's secret military activity. I could explain 99% of what people reported to me, but there was a 1% residual that I could not explain. And I'm not alone. There's over a dozen physicists who've devoted at least a decade to studying what are now called UAPs.
Right. Yeah, they've changed the vernacular on us in
They
the last couple of
keep
years.
changing the acronym, right?
Well, those are supposedly non-government, and then the UFOs are government, so that's at least.
Well, what I can share with you is there's about 2,000 documented cases where multiple observers see a UAP going through the atmosphere and going through at a high velocity, 5,000, 10,000 miles per hour, no sonic boom, no heat friction, and they actually crash into the earth. You go to the crash site, you see a shallow crater. You see melted snow. You always see damaged vegetation, but there's not a single artifact to recover. No debris.
Every time?
Every time. No debris,
no artifacts. What do you think about Roswell? Because they found the craft.
I've been to Roswell.
What do you think about that?
It's a great tourist place. I mean, everybody dresses up like a UFO being. They got flying saucers everywhere.
Sure, but I mean, so L.A. Marzulli is like an understudy of Missler, went there, and he took a metal detector, found pieces of metal, and then you have Bob Lazar, who...
Well, here's the problem.
Saying there's
they talk about these artifacts, but nobody can produce it.
Well, that would be advantageous to our government, right?
Well, for example, I've seen lunar rocks brought back by the Apollo astronauts.
Sure.
I've seen them up close.
Did you keep one?
No, I didn't keep one, but I had a friend actually handle one of them. He had authority to handle one. So there's no doubt that, we've been to the moon, we brought moon rocks back. But there's no museum that shows a piece of a UAP.
What would the problem of a physical craft created by an angel be for you?
Well, that's where I'm going.
Okay.
The fact that we see a crater and damaged vegetation tells us this is a real phenomena. It takes something to make that crater and damage that vegetation.
Yeah. Okay.
But the fact that we don't hear a sonic boom, there's no heat friction, there's no debris at the crash site, tells us we're dealing with something non-physical. Now, when I was at the University of Toronto, I briefly had Carl Sagan as a professor.
Or they're good janitors and they just pick it up.
Yeah, but 2,000 places and nothing. Nobody can report anything. Nobody can produce an artifact.
Yeah.
So, what that tells me, we're dealing with non-physical reality.
Yeah.
And where I get it from my peers is I say there's no such thing as non-physical reality. But as a Christian, I know there is something non-physical and real.
Okay.
I mean, we got God beyond space and time, creating the universe. The Bible tells us that God created two distinct species of intelligent life. Humans that are constrained by the physics of the universe, angels that are not constrained. And the Bible tells us these extraterrestrial beings
not of Earth.
Are given the property to come into our realm and leave our realm. We can't go to their realm, but they can come to our realm. So I think we're dealing with an angelic phenomena here. And when you look at the close encounters with these UAPs, we realize this is not beneficial. In every single instance of a close encounter, it's harmful. So I think we're dealing with the fallen angels. And hey, you were talking about Sasquatch earlier. I mean, if you go to Ireland, they talk about the leprechauns.
And fairies as well.
Fairies, yeah. This stuff has been going on for thousands of years. It's not new. And so we shouldn't be surprised at these. And what we notice is these angels, they can appear in any physical form they want. I mean, we had, Abraham actually giving dinner to two angels. They were eating.
Well, do angels have a body?
Well, they can take temporarily a physical form. So they can appear as an animal. They can appear as a flying saucer. They can appear as a leprechaun.
Can they take over an animal, or they become an animal, shape-shifting? Because shape-shifting sounds like they're magical. They have powers beyond, it seems like, God's created order. They're doing whatever they want.
I mean, I've encountered people that have been possessed by demons.
Yeah.
And this is where a demon comes inside a human being and takes over the body of the human being or the brain or whatever.
Well, I've seen that.
And they can do that with an animal. So when I read in the Bible about a talking donkey, I said, well, that's within the realm of possibility.
Or it's back to the order of creation, right? And we can, maybe at one point we could speak to
animals. But as an astronomer, one thing I can rule out, we're not talking beings like ourselves from another planetary system. Because we astronomers are actually focused on getting spaceships to the nearest planetary system It's only 4 light years away, but we've already figured out the laws of physics will not permit a spaceship bigger than 10 centimeters across.
So,
we're talking tiny spaceships, and even then, what we're looking at is sending 1,000 spaceships that are that small to the nearest planetary system, knowing at least half of them will be completely destroyed before they get there. But we'll have enough of them, they'll be only partly destroyed, that we'll get back meaningful information. But it is a 50-year project.
It's like a fleet of paper airplanes, kind of.
Just like the golden record they sent out in space.
Yeah.
Remember that?
No. What was on it?
Wasn't that project?
Was it the Beatles or something?
There was that mission. They put the golden record.
It was Viking. Because Viking has left the solar system.
Yeah.
And it was Carl Sagan who said, well, we're going to leave the solar system. We have to put a message on this thing in case aliens find it.
Yes. They put music on a golden record.
What do you put on there, though? Like, was it like a mixtape?
Oh, they put a number of things on there.
Like the
They put
Bee
a little
Gees? What
map
year
of
was
the
it?
solar system.
Yeah, what songs made it on the golden record?
There was one song, I forget which song it was. It was a song that Carl liked.
Well, Hugh, let me ask you this. If you got to pick the songs going on the golden record, what would you have put?
Yeah.
Well, I come from a family of musicians, but I'm not a musician. So you're asking the wrong guy.
Well, what songs do you like? If you had to put one song on there.
Well, if I had to pick one song, I'd probably pick the Brandenburg Third Concerto.
Oh, let's see. Look at this guy. Yeah, I love it, dude. He's like, we're gonna put something complex. We're gonna wow these guys.
I think there was some classical and there was some modern, and they sent it out there. I just thought that was fascinating as a musician that even became a thing, and they sent it out to space.
Hugh, I have one last question here, and that would be, in the new creation, what are you most looking forward to in that sense? If we're not constrained by dimensional or quantums, I guess you'd say, and not constrained by laws of physics and thermodynamics, and you can sort of put yourself there. What are you most looking forward to in that sense?
What I'm really looking forward to is being delivered from linear time and entering geometric time. The idea of having intimate relationships with billions of angels and people and God simultaneously, that's a mind blower.
So can you explain geometric time to us real quick?
Yeah.
It means being able to relate in at least 2 independent dimensions of time. So what that means is I could have a trillion simultaneous relationships, one-on-one, as if we're just talking, just the two of us going on simultaneously. Impossible in 1 dimension of time, but you can do that in 2 or more dimensions
It's
of time.
kind of like, if you've seen Interstellar, it's kind of like the Tesseract. You know, that scene where he's kind of...
You know what I loved about
outside of
Interstellar? All the equations in the background were correct.
Really?
Dude, this guy.
Let's go. That's Nolan. I mean, that's how he makes his films.
The story was weird. I mean, it violated the laws of physics, but the equations were correct.
I mean, I love how he can take such an intense topic and mind-bending things and make it, entertaining for the average person. Because we're not smart enough to have a conversation with you, but somehow we managed to do that.
I don't know how we snaked our way in here.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing is that we have to be in a single dimension of time now.
Sure.
Because if we weren't, evil would run out of control.
Yeah.
But if evil is not a problem, we don't have to be constrained to just 1 dimension at a time. And this is why Paul says no one can think or imagine how great and wonderful it will be. It's mind-blowing to think that we could have a relationship with one another that's better than the very best marriage that ever existed on earth, and we can have that with billions of individuals simultaneously. I mean, that's a mind blower.
Is that why they booted? Is that why those that fell are booted out of heaven? Essentially, not just like they are in open defiance, but the idea that evil has to be ejected from the heavenly realm. That's
evil will exist, but it'll be completely isolated.
It's contained here, right?
It's contained,
yes.
Right.
Hugh, this might be just like open up a whole can of worms. But when one of my thoughts is when I think about creation, and I think about created order, and doing this show, I've kind of, the list of characters kind of grows. What does it mean to you that Jesus is the only begotten Son of God? What do you think about that?
He was the first to be raised bodily from the dead.
Yeah.
So he's the first of creation.
Yeah.
Because he could be raised bodily from the dead, so could we. But, John 1 is very explicit. The Son has always existed. He has no beginning, no end, but he is the first begotten, the first to be literally raised bodily from the dead into eternal.
All things through him, by him, for him.
He created everything.
Yeah.
And so
that's wild, dude. That everything we've talked about and all the physics and astronomy and astrophysics that you've spent your life studying and written 23 books about, that Christ created, walked here, and he was the creator of all of that.
That's a mind-blowing thing. The guy who created literally everything that exists came and became a human amongst us and offered to do for us.
Yeah, he was just building chairs and stuff. He decided he was going to do something humble, like just be a carpenter, right? I mean,
yeah.
That is you could live there and just try to unwrap.
Well, it also blows me away that, he had 4 brothers. He had a mother, he had sisters, and yet in front of a large crowd that included his family, can any of you accuse me of sin? I mean, you're not going to lie to your mother, right?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, my mom knows that that's not going to work.
He always cleared the table.
She knows most of the bad things I did. Sorry, Mom. Yeah.
He always cleaned his room, cleared the table, and was nice to his siblings.
He didn't make his bed, though.
Did Jesus perform miracles when nobody was looking? What do you think? What do you think?
I don't know.
Well, he says he humbled himself and lowered himself, took the form of a human, and he always went to the Father to do anything miraculous.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he kept himself in a humble state.
The question was because there was a father-son relationship, and that's something that Christians debate over to this day. And I think when you start to look at creation, the intentionality behind everything, you see a father-son relationship. And in humans, that is one of the biggest problems in our society is a broken father-son relationship, all these problems that happen. And the more the show has kind of explored these ideas, the more I understand that. That's what I've always wanted, and that's what I want to give to my sons. And that's a huge narrative then and now, that there's a family, and we come back.
And none of us as fathers really do an adequate job.
No, we don't.
Yeah.
We don't.
It's difficult.
What a gift it is, though, Hugh, right? I mean, I was saying this the other day. I mean, we were just talking before on the pre-roll, like I became a dad at 40. You did as well. There's a whole paradigm. This is total not blurry creatures talk, but there's this whole paradigm that opens up where you get a glimpse of how our Father feels about us, and I don't think you get that unless you're a dad. Like, when you see that and you see your son, my son's 2 now, and you just realize the lengths that you would go, for him, and then you go, God feels like this about me, but.
Well, let me give you a word of encouragement. You're a lot younger than I am. When they're teenagers, they see all the faults in your fatherhood.
Yeah.
When they hit their 20s, they see all the blessings of your fatherhood. So stick it out through the teenage years.
20s, that's a little early. I think mine was 30s.
30? Well, yeah, some wait till 30, but eventually you get put up on that pedestal.
Oh, I have this amazing story. I was changing it just came up on my Facebook memories. I was changing my firstborn son's diaper, and I feel like it was just a moment that I've never. He looked at me and he said, "Thank you. Thank you, Daddy, for taking care of me."
Wow.
And I was like, who are you? How is this possible? And my second kid came out as Bam Bam, and he destroys everything. So it's totally different. But my first was like, I'll never forget that moment. And I was like, how did you even think to say that and even notice that I was doing this? It's incredible. That was like God's love to me in that moment of just, this is insane. This whole thing feels fantastical. And I love that you can weave science into the awe and wonder of what it means to be a human, and how the story has been wild since the beginning. And when day 7 gets wrapped up, it's going to get even crazier, and God's going to create again.
Well, it tells us in Psalm 19 that we got 2 books, the book of nature and the book of scripture.
Yeah.
And it actually exhorts every one of us to be a scientist and every one of us to be a theologian. So I tell people in our church, don't leave it up to the theologians. We all need to be involved. We all need to be theologians.
Let's go.
We all need to be scientists. It's way too much fun.
And I love that you put them back together. And that's what I think I really appreciate and love about your work, Hugh, is that you take these 2 books you talk about in Psalms, but you put them back together and say these two things are not in conflict. They do not cancel each other out. They do not negate each other. In fact, they affirm each other. These 2 things are actually, they are the 2 halves to the story. And I know I want to give you a chance here at the end. I know you have a new book out to kind of talk about the new book, because we are in an interesting time where, we do live in an interesting era where things are separate. We live in this sort of post Enlightenment paradigm where people say it's science or religion. and you're here saying, no, we're putting these back together. But you've written a book.
Both and.
Yeah, you've written a book, your most recent book, about the inerrant nature of the Bible. And if you want, I just want to give you a chance to tell our listeners what you got going on.
There was a team of theologians that came to me and says, Hugh, you need to write this book.
And you have 23 books. I know it's like you say you don't play golf or
fish.
So yeah, you just write books. What a legacy, man. I love that.
Well, these theologians are basically alerting me to the fact that in seminaries, there's a walk away from biblical inerrancy. And the reason why they're saying, hey, we can no longer defend biblical inerrancy, the science forces it. It says, Hugh, they're not scientists. You need to write a book. They're attacking you personally, so you need to defend yourself. So I wrote this book basically making the point, God gave us two inerrant witnesses, the book of nature and the book of scripture. And I kind of use a legal example. You know you can get a verdict if you've got two independent witnesses that corroborate one another. And so that's what we have. The book of nature, the book of scripture, they overlap, they corroborate. And so I'm basically writing this book not just for theologians, but all Christians, saying, hey, the latest science makes a stronger case for biblical inerrancy, not a weaker case. And yeah, if the book really is inerrant, then we know that God is speaking to us, and he's speaking clearly to us. It's not the Holy Spirit partnering with failed human authors. The Holy Spirit inspires the human authors to write stuff that's totally inerrant.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Love that. I mean, you're doing the Lord's work. So it's been thank you for this time. Thank you for sitting down with a couple dummies and explaining the mysteries of the universe in ways that we can understand. And
I can tell you're not dummies because you're asking all the right questions.
I appreciate it. And we're going to send you some Sasquatch material. Okay. All right. And shout out to Conduit Church here for having us, hosting us, and their staff. And you guys have been amazing to us over the years. Let us do our conference here, and you guys are incredible people.
We brought Hugh Ross in to speak, and I think your message at this point, right? I just want to iterate this one more time. It's so important, It can be yes and. It doesn't. You don't have to pick one or the other. In fact, science and the Bible are harmonious in their relationships. And the Bible says that all of creation testifies to God and to the greatness, to the majesty of God. And I think that you're doing the Lord's work. So,
how can our listeners connect with you? What's the best place to find you?
Well, reasons.org is our website. And hey, if they want free chapters of my books, reasons.org/Ross.
Okay. That's right.
If they want free books, I'm just kidding.
No. If they want free books, we don't give away the book.
Yeah,
we do give away chapters, though.
We get it.
And you write what is either a bi-weekly or every other week. You write an article.
It's called Today's New Reason to Believe. They'll find it at reasons.org. And the blog series is called Today. So every 2 weeks I put out an article.
You're a busy man.
Thank you.
No stopping the Ross train, right? We're not stopping.
I'm older than you, so time will come.
Just by a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on our podcast. Thanks for helping us unpack some of these complicated questions and busting our brains a little bit.
It's been a pleasure, guys. Yeah. I mean, I love it when you ask the right questions. It's great.
Yeah, it's hard. It's a little intimidating,
it is. It's like
smarter than 10 of you.
I was a little nervous, honestly, just because. I so appreciate your work, and I remember I was reading your book, and my wife's asking me about it, and I was like, I'm going to try to explain this, but really, he was just talking about all these crazy science stuff that just matches with the biblical narrative, and she's like, oh, cool. And she's like, what about more? And I'm like, I don't have any more. I could read it for you, line by line.
Yeah, Hugh. Well, take care, man, and thank you again for spending some time with us this morning. Appreciate it.
Very welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.